Well, good morning to everybody, or evening to some of you. I'd like to welcome you all to joining us today from around the world. And given the current state of affairs, it's necessary to have this as a virtual convening. Despite that, we're glad that this platform gives us the opportunity to engage with all of you across industries, disciplines, and continents. My name is Paul Gertler. I'm a professor in the Haas School of Business at the University of California, and this week became the director of the Institute of Business and Social Impact, where EGAL, who developed the materials and is sponsoring this webinar today, is housed. I work in many of these areas. I'm a former chief economist for human development at the World Bank, where one of my responsibilities was diversity and gender equality, working with governments to promote policies in low and middle income countries to achieve those diversity and inclusion goals. Today we're going to be talking about artificial intelligence, which is one of the largest economic opportunities of our lifetime. It's expected to contribute about $16 trillion to the global economy by 2030. As digital transformation continues to accelerate in the face of COVID-19, AI really is the topic of the hour. AI is already determining how opportunities like jobs, access to credit, and even resources like healthcare and welfare are being distributed. With COVID-19, we're seeing public and private players rushing to harness the power of AI in new ways to track, predict, and combat the spread of the virus. While incredibly exciting, these systems can replicate and even amplify inequities that already exist in society. Now more than ever, with the pandemic clearly having a disproportionate impact on people of color and women and illuminating the inequities that already exist in our society, it's becoming evident that we need to move towards a more equitable normal. To do that, mitigating biases in artificial intelligence has become a critical imperative. In some cases, AI is being used for good and explicitly to tackle biases. Indeed, some of my own work explores how credit scoring algorithms can either amplify or mitigate gender bias in access to credit and loans in the Dominican Republic, and we're expanding this work throughout all of Latin America. Clearly, AI has great transformative potential. Today, the Center for Equity, Gender, and Leadership, or EGAL, is launching their Equity Fluent Leadership Playbook on mitigating bias in artificial intelligence. EGAL, housed in the Institute of Business and Social Impact here at Haas, is dedicated to educating equity fluent leaders to ignite and accelerate change. The playbook is geared specifically for business leaders who have a central role in understanding and addressing bias in AI. By mitigating biases in AI, business leaders can unlock value, responsibility, and equity, and harness the transformative potential of AI. With a mission to educate equity-fluent leaders to ignite and accelerate change, EGAL appreciates the central role that business and business leaders play in creating positive change, and is excited to equip them with the information and resources they need to lead the change. We are honored to be joined by the leading stakeholders across private and public sectors to discuss challenges and solutions, and to shed more light on the strategies highlighted in the playbook. With that, I'll hand it over to my colleague, Genevieve Smith, Associate Director of EGAL, to share more about this wonderful playbook and introduce us to our panels. Take it away, Genevieve.
Great, thank you, Paul. Hi, everyone. This is Genevieve Smith. As Paul mentioned, I'm the Associate Director here at the Center for Equity, Gender, and Leadership. So one of the ways that we educate equity fluent leaders to ignite and accelerate change is through our playbooks, which focus on critical topics related to equity and inclusion in business. So these playbooks highlight and translate research into practitioner-oriented strategies, and also inform and support education on campus through developing things like business school case studies. So I'm thrilled today to launch our Mitigating Bias in Artificial Intelligence Playbook. There's been a focus on bias in AI as a technical issue with technical solutions, but it's not just technical. It's a much bigger business issue and one that business leaders must play a role in. Quite a lot has been written about bias in AI, but doesn't necessarily speak to the larger business solutions and opportunities. Being housed at a business school, we recognize that it's students who leave Haas and other business schools that will be dealing and grappling with repercussions of biased AI while searching to promote and embed inclusion in AI. As a center focused on diversity, equity, and inclusion in the workplace, but also in how companies operate and develop, sell, and use products, we saw the gap and also an important role for us to play. We developed this playbook to address the gap between knowledge and action for business leaders and recognize that AI is here to stay, but new approaches are needed. Today, I'm going to start us off by sharing a bit about why AI systems are biased, what the impacts are for business, the strategic evidence-based plays for business leaders to take action, and then we'll move into our incredible panel. So in 2019, I applied for a credit card. My husband applied for the same. I received a credit limit almost half the size of his, despite having slightly better credit score and the same income, expenses, and debt. When I dug into this and how this card determines limits, I only grew more suspicious that the credit limit should have been slightly in my favor. My story echoes something that made headline news late last year. A husband and wife compare their Apple Card spending limits, and despite the wife having factors in her favor, her husband had a credit limit 20 times higher. Customer service employees weren't able to explain why the algorithm had designated her to be less creditworthy. AI makes it possible to automate judgments. AI, and particularly machine learning, which is the focus of our playbook, is increasingly used to make decisions and predictions affecting most aspects of our lives. This includes things like whether someone will be offered credit and how much. It also includes things like who receives an interview for a job, or which products are advertised to which consumers. As you can see here, I've recently been getting ads for masks with wine glasses and cats and galaxies. Not totally sure how the algorithm led this ad to me, but I don't also hate it. Anyways, I'm making light of this, but on a more serious tone, it's also being used to determine how government services and resources are allocated, such as what communities are designated as high potential for crime, and also how to allocate resources to COVID-19 patients in hospitals. AI has incredible potential to make decisions more efficient and cost-effective, while also promoting higher productivity and growth in the economy. And use of AI in predictions and decision-making can reduce human subjectivity. But it can also embed biases, produce discriminatory outcomes at scale, and pose immense risks to individuals, society, and business. The goal is not to fully de-bias AI. That's not realistic. The ultimate goal is to unlock value responsibly and equitably by mitigating bias. So why are AI systems biased? At a high level, AI systems are biased because they're human creations. They're classification technologies and are products of the context in which they're created. In many cases, they mirror and replicate society. We live in a society with bias and inequality. Is it any surprise then that bias is present in AI? And who develops AI systems matters because it's their perspectives, lived experience, and knowledge that is integrated into the technology. But the who often resembles this picture. Who is in leadership matters too, as their priorities and values are also integrated in how AI is developed, managed, and used. Most large-scale AI systems are developed in a handful of tech companies and elite university labs. These are spaces that tend to be white, affluent, and male. There are huge gender and race disparities at firms and in the field of AI. At a more granular level, bias can enter in the development and use of AI systems. We created a map as part of our playbook trying to capture these different points. We think it's important that business leaders understand the scope of the issue. You can't solve a problem you don't understand. The data sets used to train an algorithm are critical. AI systems learn to make decisions based on these training data sets, and there are various points where bias can enter. Data is assumed to accurately reflect the world, but there are significant data gaps, including little or no data coming from particular communities. Data is rife with racial, economic, and gender biases. In many cases, humans decide what, where, and how data is collected and categorized. For instance, data sets used for facial recognition technology have been found to overrepresent people that are white and male. It comes as no surprise that this tech is far more accurate for white men than for Black women. Clearly, using biased data sets would result in a biased algorithm, but it's not the only way. Bias can creep in when defining the purpose of an AI model and when selecting proxies and variables for it to learn from. How it's evaluated matters too. A widely used healthcare algorithm in the US falsely concluded that Black patients are healthier than equally sick white patients, reducing the number of Black patients identified for extra care by more than half. The algorithm uses health costs as a proxy for health needs, but Black patients who have the same level of need spend less money because of unequal access to care, among other reasons. How AI is used matters too. An AI system may be used in a different context or for different populations from which it was originally developed. It can be altered in ways that can be deemed as discriminatory for certain populations, and how individuals interpret the system's output can be informed by their own lived experience and allow for bias. In early 2020, the New York Civil Liberties Union and Bronx defenders filed a lawsuit claiming the Immigration and Customs Enforcement of the US rigged an AI system to create a secret no-release policy for people suspected of breaking immigration laws. Obviously, biased AI can have immense impacts on health, safety, and well-being of individuals and society. Tackling bias in AI is, first and foremost, the right thing to do. For business leaders, it's also the smart thing to do. Companies that effectively mitigate bias in AI can mitigate risk, maintain a strong brand reputation, have a superior value proposition, stay ahead of forthcoming legislation, and be a competitive leader in a fast-paced industry. So what can business leaders do? We highlight 7 strategic evidence-based plays in our playbook, and also some quick wins. The strategic plays should inform your longer-term game plan, while quick wins can get you moving down the field. The first 2 plays are related to teams. First is enabling diverse and multidisciplinary teams working on algorithms and AI systems. As mentioned earlier, the who matters. The second is promoting a culture of ethics and responsibility related to AI, one that expects and empowers employees to prioritize equity considerations. In the playbook, we outline the elements of each play, and I'll share them with you just for the second one. So the elements of the second play are, for example, updating individual performance review processes to include a component around responsible and ethical AI practices, and updating objectives and key results and KPIs to integrate goals and metrics on mitigation of bias in AI. Also embedding training on ethics, bias, and fairness for employees developing, managing, or using AI systems. You'll see the clock icon next to a couple of these elements. That's because we have some quick win resources that can help you put these elements into action immediately. The second bucket of plays is the AI model. This includes practicing responsible data set development and establishing policies and practices that enable responsible algorithm development. We'll be delving more into this in our panel too. The last bucket is focused on corporate governance and leadership. It includes establishing corporate governance for responsible AI and end-to-end internal policies to mitigate bias. In addition to including things like establishing AI ethics principles and guidance to formalize processes, this play emphasizes assessing how leadership priorities can impact responsible AI practices and how incentive structures may keep people from speaking up about ethical issues. Also being honest and transparent about limitations. Thinking about power structures and accountability to workers and community members is related to this play too. We have another playbook in the works on equitable recovery from COVID-19 that delves into that topic a little more. The sixth play is on engaging CSR teams to advance responsible and ethical AI systems and larger systems change. And lastly, use your voice and influence to advance industry change and regulations for responsible AI. Today you can find in the playbook a snapshot overview as well as a deeper dive that delves into the bias in AI map, challenges to be aware of, and the strategic plays. We'll also be launching some other resources in the coming weeks, including guides for the strategic plays and quick wins. There's a lot to do to effectively mitigate bias in AI. So where to begin? We suggest sharing the snapshot with other internal leaders and having direct reports, project managers, and others with a mandate to advance responsible AI to read the deeper dive, and designate someone to be responsible for each play, scheduling a meeting in a month to discuss an action plan when the guides for the strategic plays are available. You can also get a quick win under your belt we are releasing one quick win today, which is a case study activity on bias, AI, and COVID-19. This is tied to play number 2, related to educating staff about responsible and ethical AI. With that, I'm going to transition us to our panel. I'm honored to be joined by our incredible panelists. Sania Golser-Korat is the Director of Gender Equality at UNESCO. She's championed diversity at senior levels of the UN and spearheaded getting gender equality to be a global priority for the UN over a decade ago. She's led research shedding light on gender bias and voice assistance powered by AI and leads work that UNESCO is doing around gender bias and AI. Donald Martin Jr. is a staff technical program manager and social impact technology strategist at Google. He focuses on driving innovation in the spaces where Google products and services intersect with society, as well as understanding the intersections between trust and safety, machine learning, fairness, and ethical AI. Deb Raji is a tech fellow at the AI Now Institute at New York University. She conducted research on the infamous Gender Shades Project, uncovering bias in facial recognition tech, and was also a recent research fellow of the Partnership on AI. She was recently named one of MIT Tech Review's 2020 35 Leaders Under 35. And Katya Walsh is the Senior VP and Chief Strategy and Artificial Intelligence Officer at Levi Strauss & Co. There she leads strategy, data analytics, and artificial intelligence. So once we are able to transition to the videos, great. Wonderful. Well, thank you again, everyone, for joining us and for our panelists joining us. I'd like to start off our panel with a question around related to COVID-19 and digital transformation that we're seeing with COVID-19. So I'm wondering if our panelists can share a little bit around what do you see as the implications for AI that uses machine learning, and what trends are you seeing, especially in this age of COVID-19?
I can maybe start. Yeah, I think with COVID-19, there's actually been sort of this influx of interesting tech intervention. So in my space, where I'm looking mostly at facial recognition tools and surveillance tools, there's been an interesting shift or like marketing pivoting of some of these tools in the COVID-19 era. So, you know, one example is a company that we were looking at that had a facial recognition product and was sort of pitching their tool in residential areas as part of like a monitoring and security processes for different apartment buildings in the COVID-19 era, sort of also try to pitch their tool as a way to facilitate entry and exit in a frictionless sort of way, and also try to pitch other functionality around being able to use their heat detection functionality to kind of detect who's sick and monitor that as people come in and out of these buildings. So I've seen on some level, especially with surveillance tools, this sort of pivoting in the COVID-19 era and making use of this moment when people want frictionless solutions, when people don't want to necessarily interact directly with other humans, and they literally can't because of contact tracing, sort of pitching the technology and encouraging the sort of over-reliance on certain technological solutions. I think, you know, even in the case of introducing new sort of technologies that would have raised a few more eyebrows with respect to privacy and consent concerns around contact tracing, for example, those are things that I think would have been harder to accept as a society if it wasn't for sort of the current pandemic. That being said, though, I think there's also at the same time a lot of advocates monitoring this very closely and trying to make sure that in the conversation around, you know, public health intervention sort of facilitated by technology, especially surveillance technology, that conversation of responsibility and that conversation of ethics is also part of the discussion, and also included in terms of the measures required for these interventions to happen. So that's sort of how I've been noticing COVID shifting dialogue in that way, where there's definitely been a little bit of an openness to some of these technologies, and some of these technologies are taking the opportunity to pitch their value, but at the same time, sort of advocates being increasingly aware of that and making sure that technologies, making sure that companies are being responsible with respect to their response.
Great.
There's one thing I'll add to this, a little bit of a different perspective. One thing that we've noticed is that there's this huge uptick in the number of people who want to try to model COVID. They want to try to create models to help predict when people can basically go back to work, to be able to open up economies. But what people are realizing is that there's a dearth of data sets that can actually provide you the information that would help you make those sorts of decisions. There are tons of data sets out there, but the data sets are being created on the fly. And depending on what region is creating them, you'll get different data. And often what's missing is a lot of context around that data. And so we're noticing lots of data sets, but not very much context. And so many models are being created. So it's hard to tell, which models you can trust. It's hard to understand where the data sets are coming from. But there is a lot of effort for people to be reaching out to places like Data for Black Lives to get help on which data sets should we choose? How can we reach out to the communities to help us even decide what factors we should be measuring? So there is some positive indications with respect to that.
Yeah, that's really interesting. It makes me think too around just how there can be a lack of data coming from particular communities, like immigrant populations, for example, aren't getting tested for fear of deportation. So it goes back to how there can be bias within the data set in some of those ways. Katya, did you want to say something?
Yes, on the note about positive trends that we are seeing, in every crisis, and this has been an unprecedented crisis, we don't have to dwell on that, but there's also an opportunity, and it's a watershed moment to really establish a responsible use of machine learning and AI, because in any time of uncertainty, there is a tremendous appetite for data, for understanding, for getting some sense of what's to come. So what we are seeing and doing at Levi Strauss & Company is we've mobilized a small but very sophisticated, very talented team to help the company prepare for what's to come and eventually prevail. And to the extent that we can predict things, given the biases in data and the dearth of data, to the extent that we can, there is a tremendous value in that as well. So some of the things that we're doing at Levi Strauss & Company include really optimizing the consumer experience online. Our digital sales have soared in the past 3 months. It's a fantastic brand. What we wanted to do earlier, but for some reason couldn't do it, now we have done in a matter of weeks. And we are using machine learning to provide the best experience for our consumers on the web, on the app, to ensure that the Levi's that they know and love is always there, regardless of what's around the world. We use machine learning across the board, across the organization. You will have seen, no doubt, that digital transformation is accelerating throughout the world, in society, in non-for-profit organizations, in various industries. And, I grew up in a communist country, surrounded by quotes by Lenin. So I never thought I would be using a quote by Lenin here and now, but it is apt to remind us what he said back in 1917 during the time of the Russian Revolution. And he said, there are months when nothing happens and weeks when decades happen. And we are in one of those moments in life that will define us. And it's our opportunity and responsibility to use this moment to also establish a responsible use of AI.
Yeah, thanks, Katya. And, kind of maybe building off of what you're talking about, I think, something that's really, I remember we prototyped the playbook with you, and something that came up is really, you emphasize the importance of, not just incentivizing staff to speak up about ethical issues, but really making it an expectation, more of like a requirement in terms of, promoting a culture of ethics and responsibility around AI. And I was wondering, can you speak a little bit to, how Levi's does that? How does Levi's build this culture of ethics and responsibility around AI? And how do you build those kind of expectations into things like hiring? How does that link to the values of the company? If you could just share a bit about that.
Certainly. So thank you very much for doing this really important work. It's near and dear to my heart. Back in '97, when I was working on my doctoral dissertation, the topic was actually objectivity in new technologies in digital channels. And objectivity by definition is lack of bias to support all important universal values like truth, fairness, inclusion, and impact. So when it comes to the people that we hire, we always look for values regardless of whether they work in AI, machine learning, merchandising and planning, product development, design, or anything else. So when we look at talent in this field, in data science in general, a great data scientist, a great machine learning engineer, a great computer scientist is not only technically very sophisticated, that person, and person is the key word, should also have a great desire to make the world a better place. And that is something I've always looked for regardless of the company that I've worked for. And of course, Levi's fosters a culture that has always exemplified that. So the 2 points I'm making are, one, that a great data scientist should have that inherently. If they don't have that, they're not a true data scientist. By definition, a great data scientist tries to make the world a better place, because we have a great capability in our hands, but the capability itself is agnostic. It can be used for good, it can be used for bad, unfortunately. And so it is a true data scientist that makes sure, as a determined effort, to deploy that for good. So that's one characteristic. The other characteristic, of course, is the environment that welcomes, fosters, and grows this. And that's when the two come together. And you cannot separate one from the other. So we look to hire these people in general. What's great about a company like Levi Strauss & Company, it's so much more than apparel. It represents tremendous values. It was in 1897 that Levi Strauss himself personally funded scholarships for women. 1897. And that started a legacy of doing tremendously courageous things because they were the right thing to do, not because they were fashionable. It was way before women could vote even. And so the reason that one could really foster responsibility in AI is the environment that the company creates, looking for that talent, and then really growing it. So how do we grow it? Let's say we have the right company, and then we get the right people. We also want to make sure that we provide them with the measures and with the practices to foster that. That includes, of course, a diverse team. You cannot have diversity of thought, diversity of product, diversity of development and applications and product without a diverse team. And it's certainly that includes gender and ethnicity and race, but it goes beyond that. It includes nationalities and perspectives and ability to challenge and freedom to do so. Diverse data, very important. There's no such thing as bad data as long as it's one of many, many data sets. The more data we can put together, and we are creating what we call a data ocean, the better it is, because it gives us that opportunity to capture more. And then, of course, there's diversity of tools and techniques in this field, no shortage of that. In the time we've already spoken, a new tool, I guarantee you, has been developed in the last 10 minutes. So we take a great data scientist with great values, we put them in a great environment with great values, and we give them the opportunity to unleash that so that they can make the impact we need.
Great. Thanks, Katya. Yeah, so interesting. And really the values of Levi's has kind of been so clear from the beginning, and it's great to see how that kind of has spread through the company in different ways. Donald, I wanted to ask you, your most recent work has been on participatory problem formulation for more fair machine learning. And I think this relates a bit to the second bucket around our plays on the AI model. But I'm wondering if you can share a little bit more around what participatory problem formulation means, and why is it important for us to pay attention to that part of the machine learning AI-based product development process?
Sure, I'd love to talk about that. So participatory problem formulation, in a nutshell, means making sure that the people that are most vulnerable to being harmed by algorithmic bias actually participate in framing the problem and understanding the problem very early on in the product development lifecycle. Because decisions that are made there include things like deciding what factors are important and choosing proxy variables. And those can have huge downstream impacts. You talked about that racially biased medical algorithm. And the root cause of that failure actually happened during the problem formulation phase of developing that system. And so a key thing is that during that phase, people leverage their perspectives and their causal assumptions about the world to make those decisions about what factors are important and how they're related. So in that particular instance, those engineers made the causal assumption that if you had more complex healthcare needs, you would spend more money on healthcare, right? And so that ignored a whole lot of historical context. And that could have been avoided if people from that community that have lived experience in that community could have participated. They would have identified other important factors. And oftentimes we start these projects with the data we have, and that leads us down these paths where we're ignoring all these critical variables. So you want to make this participatory, you want to add this participation in the problem formulation phase so that people can help determine what factors and what data sets are needed. You may not have them, but you can determine, hey, this is an important factor, and you do that collaboratively. And you have to value lived experiences on par with people who have PhDs and expertise in computer science. That expertise is just as valuable, and in some cases more valuable.
Yeah, definitely goes back to kind of the who's involved in these processes and whose perspectives are integrated, and really how to meaningfully engage these different communities in the different phases, because it's not only the data set that bias can enter in, it's, like you said, the problem formulation process too. So that's really exciting work that you're doing. And it kind of transitions a bit to Deb. Deb, you've worked on some of this kind of ethical machine learning work as well. And maybe to start, you've worked on the Gender Shades Project, which is widely featured research about facial recognition. And your research kind of highlighted how using data sets that over or underrepresent women and people of color can lead to less accuracy, kind of the example that I shared before, and has prompted companies to update their data sets and their AI systems, even stop using facial recognition tech. Can you share more about your research and recommendations for companies from this?
Yeah, for sure. And I think the work that we did with Gender Shades and the follow-up studies after that initial audit did reveal that, as a community, as a computer vision community, but also the broader machine learning community, a lot of the data sets that we take as the norm. So a lot of our research data sets, a lot of the data sets that were sort of accepted as the norm with respect to industry practice on how to assess and evaluate these systems, the evaluation procedures connected to the way that we use these data sets, really underrepresented particular communities. In particular, we were looking at darker skinned women, because that was a group that we were kind of personally connected to and focused on, but other groups as well. And what we found was that because a lot of these companies were not even evaluating their systems on these populations, on subjects from these different, these underrepresented subgroups, they would be deploying technology. So, something that I think some people don't always realize is that the models that we audit, the facial recognition models that we audit as part of Gender Shades and subsequent work with the Algorithmic Justice League, which is the group that kind of is doing a lot of this work, the models that we audit are not, models that are sort of built in isolation and tested in isolation. These are models that someone had already decided to deploy. So they had passed some kind of deployment measure that hadn't actively evaluated its performance for these underrepresented or these underconsidered groups. And that was really the main realization that we came to, that a lot of companies were not testing on minority populations. A lot of companies weren't even reflecting on them or thinking about them as part of their process. I really like what Donald mentioned around when you include these groups and you allow them to participate in the process of building and designing, but also in the sort of, when you consider these groups and respect these groups to the point where you include them, you actively consider, their well-being and the performance on these populations as part of the evaluation process at the company, then you wouldn't be deploying a tool that only works, less than 70% of the time on, on a particular group. So I think a lot of our work was really just a kind of exposure of the fact that a lot of the sort of evaluation processes that even some of these very big companies, Amazon, Microsoft, IBM, were not at all testing for sort of these underconsidered and underrepresented groups, specifically the darker darker female population, but also other groups that we hadn't even evaluated for. And then I think sort of another conclusion, or a separate conclusion that we had kind of arrived at as part of this whole project was, one, we're really not testing for specific groups, but two, there's also multiple other dimensions of concern outside of just functionality. And I think that led to the very recent decision by some of the companies that we had previously audited to pull facial recognition off the market, to pull their facial recognition products off the market, was that, after we had pointed out some of these blind spots with respect to how they're evaluating and assessing these tools, it started a conversation around what does it mean for this technology to actually work? And then it led to people sort of discussing and realizing that, okay, diversifying data is not, because in response to our work, for example, IBM decided to collect more faces and create a more diverse data set. However, in the process, of doing that, they had to rely on Flickr data, for example, and the consent process around the way that they had obtained that data was not very explicit, and there were a lot of privacy concerns that were raised. And then the discussion kind of evolved in the sense of, oh, wait, it's not enough to just diversify the data. We also have to think about privacy. We also have to think about consent. And that evolved the conversation towards, well, how easy is it to weaponize this kind of technology where almost, deep learning is the main sort of method through which a lot of these facial recognition products that we evaluate are built. And deep learning as a method sort of requires a lot of resources. So it requires a lot of resources for training, but also requires a lot of data in order to be trained. And that's like a feature of the technique. So, what does it mean to have a particular process or a particular algorithm that has this huge data requirement or this huge resource requirement by design? What does that actually do with respect to the way it distributes power across, the person that's using the technology versus the person that's affected by the technology? So there was a lot of questions. It kind of opened up this Pandora's box of interesting dimensions to consider with respect to ethical considerations. That led to some of my later work on documentation, where we kind of realized that, like, wait, we don't even actually have a useful map. And this is actually why a lot of your work too is really important as well, where we don't even have a good vocabulary or a great way of mapping out all the different things to consider, all the different ways to approach this problem. So I'm really grateful for that experience to, one, expose sort of this data bias issue that we kind of hadn't really addressed as a machine learning community for a long time, but also to sort of open up this broader conversation around all the different ways and all the different concerns that we have around specific technologies like facial recognition.
Yeah, so much interesting stuff there that I just want to dig into a lot. I think, one thing that I feel like a lot of times when you talk about bias in AI, people tend to focus on bias in AI is because of a biased data set, and obviously that's a big way that bias can go into AI, but as we've talked about, it's not the only way. And even within the bias data set, I mean, you can build the data set, but then it comes with all these privacy issues and potential, struggles there, et cetera, that you highlight. And I'm wondering, you mentioned briefly a little bit around kind of documenting, the importance of documenting machine learning systems. Can you share a little bit around your work around ethical AI and model cards? It's actually something that we highlight in our fourth play as well. So yeah, if you can share a little bit about that.
Awesome. Yeah. So about the same time that I was working with the Algorithmic Justice League on sort of auditing facial recognition technologies, and even, while doing my work at the AI Now Institute right now, I've been very involved with colleagues at Google, like Donald and others, and thinking about how to work on not just, so a lot of my other work is looking at external auditing sort of as a person external to the system. How can I gauge from the outside how well this system performs on different populations, and how can I use that to sort of promote particular advocacy outcomes around that technology? Internally, though, there's a lot of work that can be done with respect to how to assess and internally evaluate the performance of the model. There's a lot of internal auditing work that needs to happen as well. And I think that was really the prompt for model cards and the subsequent work. We have a paper called Closing the AI Accountability Gap, where we talk about all the different documents that don't exist as part of the machine learning development pipeline and that we need to start considering. And we look at other industries. So we look at the aerospace industry, we look at practice with the medical device industry. So sort of more technology that's sort of more deeply integrated within these regulatory environments that require a lot more documentation than we hold ourselves to in machine learning. And we say, like, which of these documents should we begin to consider in machine learning? So a very common sort of example of something that I think many machine learning engineers make decisions about, but they don't necessarily reflect on, is taxonomy, like the label taxonomy. So sometimes you'll have, and there's been a lot of great recent work. There was great work recently on the tiny images data set. And there's been work by my colleagues at AI Now on ImageNet, which is another sort of very big image data set, but identifying that a lot of the image data sets that we use in computer vision include sort of as labels racial slurs or very problematic labels like thief. How can you tell that from someone's face? So some of these categories and some of the objectives of the model themselves being problematic, but also being sort of decisions that were sort of implicitly engineered without true reflection of the responsibility and the role and the agency that the engineer has in terms of controlling these outcomes. So a lot of the work with respect to documentation is around that. With model cards, it's kind of saying like, hey, as an engineer, at minimum, communicate to yourself, but also to others about all of these decisions that you're making that can actually affect outcomes for different populations. And as you do that, we found that as people sort of went through that process of trying to reflect on, ethical considerations, reflect on the objective of the model, reflect on how that objective, how their decision making as engineers impacts that objective and impacts different populations, and having them record that in a small sort of one pager that can be shared with their colleagues. It kind of forced them into a position of having to be reflective about ethics and having to be reflective about being responsible with respect to their role as engineers. So yeah, I think the Model Cards project and the subsequent work that we've done with respect to thinking and reflecting on documentation has sort of stemmed from that desire to push engineers to be more reflective and to actively engage in communicating around some of these decisions that they're making and how it impacts the outcomes that we see, and how it is very much their responsibility and very much tied to the, what it means to ethically practice in this field.
Yeah, definitely. And I love I think it's a really important tool to use, and it kind of ties also to what Donald was saying too around, how can we build responsibility into developing machine learning algorithms and, having the documentation, but also having the participatory piece, but then thinking about teams, who's on your team that has that diversity, that can bring those diversity perspectives, that is that diversity. How can you engage communities more so, building that responsibility and ethics in, like Katya was talking about, all different pieces of the puzzle. And I'm wondering, Gulser, to turn to you, obviously there's things within organizations and there's these different resources and tools to kind of build more ethics into AI that business leaders should be aware of and should be implementing. But what about partnerships? Partnerships to advance industry change and regulations for responsible AI. That's something that's clearly really important, and again, it's part of our 7th play. And can you share a little bit about what UNESCO is doing and how the UN is thinking about bias in AI?
Sure. Thank you, Genevieve. First of all, thank you for inviting UNESCO to take part in this very important conversation. Congratulations for the playbook. I took a quick look this afternoon. It looks really great. Congratulations to you and Ishita. And I'm very happy to be here with all these wonderful experts. In fact, one of the events we were hoping to organize back in March in Paris was about gender equality and AI, gender bias in AI, and both yourself and Deborah, you were supposed to be here. We had to cancel it. Google was involved, even supporting us financially. So this is a wonderful opportunity to catch up a little bit. Before I respond to your question, may I say something about the first question, because I didn't get a chance to intervene. One of the things that worries us about what is happening with COVID-19 and the pace of change is that of the 62 countries that were being tracked in April and May, only 29 collected sex disaggregated data. 20 countries did it partially, and 12 simply ignored that. So already you have something happening in terms of information, in terms of data sets that would affect many other processes. Interestingly, United States was one of the countries which did not collect sex disaggregated data, at least in the beginning. And I read in the New York Times at the time that the Center for Disease Control and Prevention seemed to think that determining the rate of infection, fatality ratio, or differences in symptoms between men and women were simply not relevant. So, after all the experience we've had with SARS, HIV, Ebola, to 2012 cholera outbreak, I'm really shocked to hear this argument in this case, in COVID-19 case. Now, let me go back to the partnerships. UNESCO is a United Nations agency. It's a specialized agency. And we currently have 193 member states. So building partnerships is really the only way we can operate, the only way we function as an intergovernmental organization. We do have the global convening power, and we regularly bring together all our stakeholders, not only governments, but also academic world, civil society groups, and increasingly the private sector together to discuss different issues, a whole range of issues. Focusing specifically on gender equality, which is the area I'm responsible for at UNESCO, we were hoping to organize a conference to build up on the report that we published in March 2019, which made a lot of noise, especially in the media, because we talked about artificial intelligence powered voice assistants, and we gave examples from the four main ones: Siri, Cortana, Alexa, and Google Assistant, showing that the responses provide the gendering of these voice assistants, first of all, mostly in female persona and behavior. And secondly, the responses these voice assistants were providing in as a way of countering especially sexual innuendo and sexual statements were just unacceptable. Our research showed very clearly that this female voice assistants and the way they provided evasive and playful responses to sexual innuendos really intensified the sexual stereotypes, the gender stereotypes, and had a very negative effect, especially on young children, young girls and boys. Because of the name recognition of these voice assistants, it created a lot of media traction, and unwittingly, it wasn't one of our objectives, but unwittingly the report started a conversation with the private sector. So UNESCO had the opportunity to attend the Web Summit in November in Portugal, and I was involved in a fireside chat explaining the findings of the report to 70,000 people from that community. So we wanted to follow up on that and organize a conference in March to also to mark the International Women's Day and continue the conversation with the private sector. Unfortunately, due to the pandemic and the rate of infection, which went really high in France in the beginning of March, we had to cancel. We had to reorient the event due to the pandemic. Instead, we launched a global dialogue with the private sector, with some of the panelists who had agreed to come to our conference. And you were one of them. Thank you again. We engaged in a conversation around a number of set questions. This work is still in progress, and we hope to have the report in the next few weeks. And we hope that the findings and recommendations of our work, which is focusing on gender equality principles, will also contribute to the development of broader frameworks. Now, at the same time, in parallel to this, UNESCO was asked by its 193 member states to develop a recommendation on the ethical dimensions of AI. This is going to be a 2-year process. It has already started. Our colleagues have conducted an online conversation with 24 experts. And at the end of this process of consultations, there is now a draft recommendation, which is available online on the UNESCO website. I sent you the link earlier today, so please share it with all your networks. Don't be scared. There are 190 questions on the survey, but most of them are optional, so it shouldn't take too long. What we are hoping for is that through this inclusive and multidisciplinary process, whereby anybody who wants to participate can participate, we will have the results of these consultations with a wide range of stakeholders, including the experts from the scientific community, people of different cultural backgrounds, ethical perspectives, minority groups, civil society, of course, government, which is our main interlocutor, and hopefully the private sector. And our plan is to have the draft recommendation ready to be presented to the UNESCO governing body in the fall of 2021. So partnerships, in this case, I think one of the issues is that the technology is moving too fast. The governments are not able to come up with any meaningful frameworks, because of the way it is developing around the globe, there is some nobody knows who is responsible for this, who is going to be able to come up with the structure and the framework that would be respected and complied with. So as UNESCO, we are trying to do our part. We have a long history of setting standards and coming up with normative instruments. As far as I know, we are the only agency in the UN system which is currently working on it, both from a gender equality perspective and from a broader ethical perspective.
Great. Thanks for sharing. It's really interesting to hear what UNESCO is doing and the different partnerships to kind of, there's a lot of regulations that are needed and it's still quite emerging. We don't have
Could I add just 3 quick points? I think this is very, very helpful. One thing that we've noticed, and I think it will help us, and it's possibly a point within the playbook, is that it's everyone's responsibility. Who is responsible? It's on all of us, and that's exactly why you are issuing this playbook and making it available to the world. But within that responsibility is also a goal to humanize this field. Words like artificial intelligence, machine learning, by definition could scare business executives, organizational leaders, and it is also our responsibility to step back a little bit and remind people that this is actually a human development and a human application, and it's up to humans to make sure that it's used appropriately, responsibly, and for the good of society. And within that, as a third key point, a lot of this is not new. AI itself is not new. It started in the 50s, but more than that, it was developed as a field of science. So the model cards that we just talked about, they are wonderful practice of documenting your work, which has been the essence of science and peer review from the beginning of that. And within that, a code of conduct, a code of ethics, which, by the way, we have at Levi's, and it's very important for anyone that touches data. that is nothing new either. That's why doctors have taken a Hippocratic oath for centuries to do no harm. So I think it's important to acknowledge that this is new and developing very fast, but at the same time, realize that it's also human. We are all responsible, and it's on all of us to ensure that it takes us where we need to go.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's related to one of our questions. We don't have too much time for questions, but it's related to one of the questions that maybe someone can tackle, which is, how do we ensure that teams that develop AI are multidisciplinary? That we talked about that diversity, but also multidisciplinary. And then how do we make sure that technical teams who might be less inclined to believe non-technical individuals' lived experience, what's being done internally at companies to make sure that technical teams are listening to that those non-technical individuals? Maybe one person can take that, since we have just little time left.
I'll try to say something about that one. I think one of the issues with the multidisciplinary teams is that all these different disciplines speak a different language. And so when you're trying to get someone to learn someone else's language, there's a lot of resistance there. So I think one of the things we need to do in this space is really to start to build fluency and competency in thinking about systems thinking. And I think that can be a new common language that all the disciplines have to learn for the first time. And I think it can help bridge some of these gaps. My role is a technical program manager. And so it's my job in Google to bring teams together from different disciplines. And so one of the techniques we use is try to create a shared language that doesn't exist. So I think that could be one of the approaches that we can lean into. And in particular, I think systems thinking and people being aware of the underlying structures that are driving a lot of the problems will be a key ingredient that we need.
Yeah, absolutely. And then lastly, I know, Deb, that we talked about this, but we're a business school. Can you briefly share what you think needs to change in the education system, not just for engineers and data science, but maybe for business school students? If you can say something quickly about that. I know we've talked previously about it.
I think this comes from my experience because I studied engineering, and I kind of had a lot of difficulty getting any kind of exposure to education or knowledge about ethics, about any of these topics. Also, it was before this was a cool topic to discuss, so it was a little bit premature. But I think there seems to be a sort of shift towards the solution of just, sprinkle in a little bit of ethics or sprinkle in a little bit of social science into this broader fixed curriculum to teach, I guess in my case, engineering or CS or business, and just, sprinkle in one unit of one course to talk about ethics. And I think that this approach, although helpful in terms of providing some vocabulary to business students or engineering students, doesn't necessarily get at the heart of a lot of these issues here, which requires this very interdisciplinary sort of collaboration, if that makes sense. So I think there needs to be sort of a shift towards actually teaching students how to value the perspectives from these other stakeholders, how to understand who to reach out to get a particular type of expertise, and how to collaborate with that person to answer very specific questions. So I think that lesson with respect to how do we actually collaborate with disciplines outside of our own in order to properly understand and characterize this problem, and imagine sort of the future of this technology together. I think that piece is a little bit missing with respect to my education, and I'm sure it might be a parallel story with respect to business of sort of prioritizing courses sort of oriented towards collaboration and thinking about how to communicate to these students the value of these other disciplines, rather than just showing them a glimpse of that discipline through one module or a single set of courses or a single set of lessons and over the length of an entire course.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, we have about 60 seconds. I'd like to turn it over to Kelly. Sorry for the brief conclusion, Kelly. You can wrap all that up in a minute and share a call to action. That'd be great.
It's a good thing I can talk fast, Genevieve. Thank you. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Kelly McElhaney, the founder of the Center for Equity, Gender, and Leadership. And I couldn't be more proud of my team. This was such a huge undertaking, such incredible value that they are delivering to you all and hopefully to the entire world. I want to thank Guse, Deb, Donald, and Katya for you. I lie awake a lot stressing about bias in general and social injustice and all of it in AI, it really keeps me awake at night. But when I hear from the four of you who I know are out there working on solutions, I really like this construct of let's stop calling it machine and artificial. It's human beings. We're all responsible for this. So it's really clear always, but particularly at a time in which we are now with COVID amplifying racial and gender inequities, that we all get on this. I'm just going to end in 2 seconds. Well, okay, 5 seconds. A couple of things to do. Please do download this playbook. I cannot continue to tell you and impress upon you the vast amount of knowledge, work, and just incredible value that you'll get. You don't need to do anything. You'll get an email from us after this event with the link. Second, if you could please fill out also the post-event survey, not only to make our events better, but to tell us which part of this playbook you are most interested in. And then finally, because this is such an incredible wealth of information, stay tuned for a brown bag series that will launch in the fall that will tease apart individual plays, since they're all so rife with information. So go out, be safe. Thank you so much for your attention. And please, this is the human imperative. So we are all humans on this webinar. Let's go out and solve for it. Take care, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks
so
for
much.